It was the Passover season, and Jesus had come to celebrate the holy festival, which had been established way back in Moses' day. This holy festival commemorates the time of God's mighty acts of freeing the Hebrews from Pharaoh and bondage. In this season of Passover, we encounter a man named Nicodemus. He was a religious ruler. Nicodemus was highly respected, successful, and as a Pharisee, Nicodemus had committed his entire life to studying the scrolls and the Bible and the laws of Moses and the traditions of the temple. He had taught the people the laws and the traditions, and he had taught them well. He was an expert at what he did. We could say that Nicodemus was a man of faith. So in many, many ways, he and his story do not represent people without faith, but it represents people of faith. Nicodemus knew the traditions and he knew the scripture inside and out. And yet, there came a moment in this Passover season when Nicodemus felt as though he knew nothing. Have you ever come to that time in an experience in your life? You know what you know, but yet when you come to that experience, it feels like you know nothing of what you knew. It's kind of an odd kind of feeling, and Nicodemus had that kind of feeling. John's Gospel tells us that Nicodemus came to Jesus by night. We really don't know why Nicodemus came to Jesus by night or why he chose that particular time. Maybe he came that night because he wanted to know more about Jesus. And he didn't want the other Pharisees, the other 69 of the Pharisees, knowing that he had visited Jesus. After all, there were times in the scripture that we learned that Jesus was in direct conflict with some of the Pharisees over issues of authority and healing on the Sabbath. So who really could blame Nicodemus for wanting to come in the night and not stir up any trouble with his colleagues if it turned out that Jesus wasn't who Jesus claimed to be? Or maybe Nicodemus came to Jesus at night because Jesus had stirred up some emotions, some thoughts, some confusion, some curiosity in Nicodemus by the day. Nicodemus had been evidently an eyewitness to what Jesus was doing, healing, teaching with authority. And in fact, just a few verses back, if we go back into the text, we find that Jesus had just turned water into wine. And no one had ever done that before. These were signs to Nicodemus. Signs that Jesus was directly from God. And he wanted to explore. He wanted to investigate. He wanted to get a better understanding of who is Jesus. We all want to get a better understanding of who is Jesus. And so Nicodemus goes by night. Or maybe Nicodemus went by night because it was a convenient time. The demands of the day his job, his family responsibilities, his schedule, and every other responsibility that he had only allowed him to go at night when things sort of wound down. And so this is the time that Nicodemus chose to go to Jesus. But it really doesn't matter what time, day or night, that we go to Jesus. The fact is, we need to go to Jesus. But then I had this thought as I was reading this passage. A revelation came to me. Maybe John, the writer of this gospel, is not just trying to tell us that Nicodemus went to Jesus because he didn't know all of the answers. Maybe Nicodemus going to Jesus at night was an act of prayer. Many of us, during the nighttime, when things are winding down, we're kind of settling in for the night. The mind-boggling things that we have experienced during the daytime, those are the hours in which our mind begins to seek answers, begin to seek clarity and understanding about what we have just experienced in the day. It is many times that I find myself in the night finding the solution as God reveals the solution of how I can deal with the issues and the problems that had confronted me that day. And so, maybe Nicodemus just went to Jesus to have a conversation with Jesus about the things that were troubling him in his life. I don't know much about this author named Neil Douglas Walsh. I encountered his books on my daughter's bookshelf a couple of times, and his book is entitled Conversations with God, an Uncommon Dialogue. And I noticed the books on her bookshelf as she was struggling herself, as she was searching for answers to her faith, to her life dilemmas, to her situation that she found herself in. And so she was reading these books. And I opened up the page and began to read a little bit of what Walsh had to say. And so he tells about his conversation, his experience with God. And he says this: in the spring of 1992, it was around Easter, as I recall, an extraordinary phenomenon occurred in my life. God began talking to you through me. Let me explain, he says. I was very unhappy during that period, personally, professionally, and emotionally, and my life was feeling like a failure on all levels. As I had been in the habit for years of writing my thoughts down in letters, which usually I never delivered, I picked up my trusty yellow legal pad and began pouring out my feelings. This time, rather than another letter to another person I imagined to be victimizing me, I thought I'd go straight to the source, straight to the greatest victimizer of all. I decided to write a letter to God. It was a spiteful, passionate letter, full of confusion, contortions, and condemnations, and a pile of angry questions. Why wasn't my life working? What would it be? What would it take for it to work? Why could I not find happiness in relationships? What was the experience of inadequate money always going to elude me? Finally, and most emphatically, what have I done to deserve a life such as continual struggle? Then he writes, to my surprise, as I scribbled out the last of my bitter unanswered questions and prepared to toss my pen aside, my hand remained poised over the paper, as if it was held there by some invisible force. Absolutely, the pen began to write on its own. I had no idea what it was about to write, but an ideal seemed to be coming, so I decided to go with the flow. Out came, do you really want an answer to all these questions, or are you just venting? I blinked my eyes, and then my mind came up with a reply. I wrote down this too. Both. I'm venting, sure, but if these questions have an answer, I would sure like to hear them. You are sure about a lot of things, was the response. But wouldn't it be nice to be sure as heaven? And I wrote, what is that supposed to mean? And before I knew it, I had begun a conversation, and I had begun to write so much that it wasn't just writing, it was taking dictation. For 3 years, he said, he wrote these conversations between him and God. And in his third book, he wrote this: all of your life you have been told that God created you. You are creating God. When I first heard these words in my mind and placed them in this manuscript, I knew I was dealing here with nothing short of spiritual revelation. I realized I said this before, but I want to say it again for emphasis, so you may be clear as to the exact nature of the spirits to which conversations with God invite you. You are being drawn into a new understanding of life, a new level of awareness of who you are. You are being called to a new level of commitment to move to a new level of consciousness in service of creating a new world. You are being inspired to engage more fully and on a more personal level than before in that divine process of evolution that humanity may advance even more rapidly across the time